Hey, it's Callum Bose here. In this video, we're going to learn about some fields in a Knack app and when they're good to use and you should avoid using them. So I have an example Knack app set up, and it's just an app for invoicing and generating invoices, basically. So the data structure is very simple. We've got a table of invoices. Each invoice has a date and a client. So we've got a connected client, and each client has a name. So an invoice is for a client, and then an invoice is made up of line items. So each line item is for a particular invoice, has a description, quantity, price per unit, and then a calculated total. So I've built out some example data here. You can see, for example, our line items. We got like 1 of 500 equals $500 total, or 2 of $25 equals $50 total. This line item belongs to this particular invoice. In my app, I've also got a couple of very simple pages built out, table of invoices, a child page where you can edit or view details about an invoice, and that contains a grid of line items. Let's go have a look at just the relevant parts of that. So I've got an add invoice form where I can set the date, and then I can go into my invoice and I can add line items. So product A, 2 of $55, and product B, 1 of $100. So very, very simple, the very basics of what you might build into an invoicing app if you were building something like that. Now, this is where this kind of setup though lends itself well to looking at when some fields are useful and when they're not. So an obvious thing that we're seeing here is how do we know the total value of this invoice? So we know the value of the line items, but we want to know the total value. So that's where a sum field could be useful. Now, before I launch into actually adding a sum field though, we want to have a little bit of a think about it, because every equation field that you add, like a sum field or various other fields that you can do, so equation fields, if we add a field here, see there's sum, min, max, average, count. All of these deal with doing some operation on the connected record, so summing all the values of the connected line items for an invoice. What's the minimum value of all the connected line items? What's the average of the connected line items, etc. So all of those are super useful, but they come with a bit of a performance hit each time you use them. So if you add a sum field, now when you add a line item to an invoice, Knack has to recalculate based on all the other line items, the value in the invoice. And so the database has to do a whole lot more operations when you make an update. And quite a few of them on their own, totally fine. But if you do too many of them, especially if you do it in multiple layers of different parts of your database, then you can start slowing things down a little bit in your database. So the first kind of guideline is let's only use these where we really need to use them. So if I'm thinking of adding a sum field here to get the total for an invoice based on the line items, that is the obvious thing to try first. But I'm going to think about, do I really want to do that yet? Or can I achieve that in some other way that doesn't involve storing that value? So our first kind of thing that we wanted to see is what's the total of this invoice on this page? Well, I can do that in a bit of a different way. Let's look at adding a total row to this table instead. So on my edit invoice page, I can go to the settings of that line items grid, and I can add a column summary, total, save. Then if I go back and refresh my front end, I should see that we get a line item total here. Now we don't actually want the quantity and the price per unit totaled here, so I can turn those off. In the settings of those columns, go allow summary no, save, refresh, and then I have the total value of my invoice. So if that's the only place that I wanted to see the total value of my invoice, well, I don't really need a sum field. Now, what if I want to see the total value of an invoice in a list like that? Well, that's a place where we may start wanting to see the value here. Like, let's say I wanted to say what's the total of all my invoices. So I could probably do that with a report view or something like that, but that's where I can't really achieve that with any sort of native method that doesn't involve adding a field. So that's where it might be useful to consider adding a sum field. Let's go and add that sum field now. So if I go to my invoices table, I can add a field, sum, and I'll call it total value. I think that's pretty good. That'll do anyway. Add some decimal places. Add a $ in front. It's looking pretty good. Now notice when I added that, I was summing the invoice line item ID, which isn't quite right. I actually want to sum the line item total. So I'm summing the calculated value of each line item. Now when I've added that, if I have a lot of records in my database, I might find that this takes a little while to update. And I think we're seeing some different values here that aren't making sense. Okay, that's making sense now. So it takes a little while to what's called reindex or recalculate the value when you add a formula like that. So now in my invoices table, I can go and add the total value and refresh. And now I get the visibility of how much that invoice is worth based on all its line items. And let's see if that's working. Yes, it is. Okay, cool. So now, that is a problem that was appropriate to solve by adding a sum field because we couldn't really achieve that in another way. Whereas if we only needed to see that total in here, we were able to achieve it without adding the sum field and therefore having that small performance hit as a result. An even better reason to use a sum field is if we are wanting to do maths off the sum. So like I said already, there may be other ways to achieve, like being able to see a list of invoices and their total values using like a report view or something like that. But we don't really need to go into that now. The maths part though is something that you definitely can't achieve in any other way. So let's say we wanted to calculate the tax on the total invoice. So let's say we needed to add 10% tax to each invoice's total value. Now, because we're storing that as a field, we can now do maths off that field. So we can go a equation plus tax. We can use the total value times, let's call it 1.1, adding 10% tax. And we're going to give the result in 2 decimal places with a $. Now, we should see in here that we've added tax. And once again, I can show that in my grid of invoices if I want to. And there we go. So there was 2 good reasons there to add a sum field. Well, one really good reason in essence, which is that what you wanted to do wasn't possible to do with a report view or like a total row. So a sum field is used to sum connected whatever things they are. So in this case, it's line items, and show that value in like a parent record. And then that value of that sum field can be used for further operations like doing maths or whatever. And then of course we can do all sorts of other interesting things here, like showing report of invoices based on their total value, putting a total row on this table, just similar to what we did in the invoice line items. Basically all sorts of things are opened up by using the sum field, but I was able to carefully think it through and only use it where I really needed it, given that it involves a bit of a performance trade-off by adding it. And like I said, one sum field on its own, not a big deal. 50 sum fields can start to really slow things down, so only use them where they really are needed. If you like this video, Like and subscribe to my YouTube channel, and you'll get notified about any new videos I release to do with how to use Knack. I also offer coaching and development in Knack and other low-code tools. So if you need help with your project, get in touch with me at enlivenit.com.au/contact, or you can find me on LinkedIn.